On December 7, 1941, the tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor erupted into chaos. Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack that devastated the U.S. Pacific Fleet, plunging America into World War II. This marked the beginning of the Pacific War, a brutal conflict fought across thousands of kilometers of ocean, islands, and jungle battlefields. Unlike the European theater, where armies clashed over vast landmasses, the Pacific War was a test of naval supremacy, air power, and the resilience of soldiers fighting on remote, hostile terrain. What began as an ambitious expansionist campaign by Imperial Japan quickly spiraled into an all-consuming struggle between two military giants. From the blood-soaked beaches of Guadalcanal to the fiery skies over Midway, and finally to the atomic bombings that brought the war to an end, the Pacific War shaped the course of history. This article delves into the key moments of this titanic struggle, tracing the rise and fall of Japan's empire and the relentless American counteroffensive that led to ultimate victory. By the early 20th century, Japan had transformed into a formidable military power, eager to expand its influence across Asia. Following its victories in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, and World War I, Japan sought to dominate the Pacific and secure vital resources, particularly oil and rubber. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the brutal war against China, which began in 1937, were clear indicators of Japan's imperial ambitions. However, Japan's aggressive expansion alarmed Western powers. In response, the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands imposed economic sanctions, cutting Japan off from critical supplies. Faced with a strangling oil embargo, the Japanese military leadership decided on a bold and devastating course of action, a preemptive strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. At dawn on December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft soared over the Hawaiian Islands, their mission clear: cripple the American naval presence in the Pacific. At 7:48 a.m., the first bombs struck. Within 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was in ruins. Battleships were sunk, airfields destroyed, and over 2,400 Americans lay dead. The Japanese High Command celebrated the success of the operation, believing they had neutralized the American threat long enough to solidify their control over the Pacific. However, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the attack, harbored doubts. He famously warned, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His fears would soon be realized. While the smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, Japan unleashed a series of lightning-fast offensives across the Pacific. Within months, they conquered British-controlled Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore, as well as the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. The Philippines fell, forcing U.S. General Douglas MacArthur to flee to Australia, where he made his famous vow, "I shall return." By mid-1942, Japan controlled one of the largest empires in history, stretching from the islands of the Central Pacific to the jungles of Southeast Asia. But this expansion came at a cost. Japan had overextended itself. The United States, with its vast industrial might, was preparing to strike back. Despite suffering a devastating attack at Pearl Harbor, the United States wasted no time preparing its response. President Franklin D. Roosevelt demanded swift action, and by April 1942, the U.S. military devised an audacious plan: a direct air raid on Tokyo. Led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, 16 B-25 bombers took off from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet on April 18, 1942. The mission was largely symbolic. The damage inflicted on Tokyo was minimal, but its psychological impact was immense. The Japanese home front, which had believed itself invulnerable, was shaken to its core. More importantly, the attack forced Japan to rethink its strategy. In response, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned an ambitious offensive to crush American resistance in the Pacific once and for all. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive naval battles. By June 1942, Japan sought to lure the remaining U.S. fleet into a trap at Midway Atoll, a strategic island in the Central Pacific. However, thanks to American codebreakers who had cracked Japan's communication system, Admiral Chester Nimitz was ready. On June 4, 1942, as Japanese forces launched their initial air attack on Midway, U.S. aircraft carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown lay in wait. American dive bombers struck with devastating precision, sinking 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, in a matter of minutes. Later that day, the last Japanese carrier, Hiryu, was also destroyed. Midway was a catastrophic defeat for Japan. 4 of its prized aircraft carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, were lost, along with hundreds of elite pilots. From this moment forward, Japan would be on the defensive, and the United States would take the initiative. With momentum shifting, the United States devised a new strategy: island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese stronghold, U.S. forces would bypass heavily fortified islands, capturing key positions that could serve as launching points for future assaults. The first major test came at Guadalcanal in August 1942. Here, U.S. Marines faced brutal jungle warfare against determined Japanese defenders. For 6 months, both sides suffered heavy casualties in land, sea, and air battles. Finally, in February 1943, Japan abandoned the island, marking its first significant defeat on land. Guadalcanal proved that Japan was not invincible and that American forces were capable of sustained offensive operations. As more U.S. troops and warships entered the Pacific, the tide of war continued to turn in favor of the Allies. With the success of Guadalcanal, the United States pressed forward with its island-hopping strategy in late 1943. The next target was the Gilbert Islands, a small but strategically vital chain of atolls in the Central Pacific. The Battle of Tarawa, fought from November 20th to 23rd, 1943, would serve as a grim preview of the costly battles to come. Tarawa was heavily fortified, with over 4,500 Japanese defenders dug into bunkers, pillboxes, and underground tunnels. The U.S. launched an amphibious assault, but the shallow coral reefs surrounding the island trapped landing craft, forcing Marines to wade through chest-deep water under heavy machine gun fire. The battle lasted 76 hours and resulted in staggering casualties. Over 1,000 U.S. Marines were killed, with nearly 2,300 wounded. Almost every Japanese soldier fought to the death, with fewer than 20 prisoners taken alive. The bloodbath stunned the American public, revealing the brutal nature of the Pacific War. Undeterred, the U.S. military pushed forward in early 1944, capturing the Marshall Islands, including Kwajalein and Eniwetok, in February. With each battle, American tactics improved, and their dominance in air and naval power became overwhelming. The next objective was the Mariana Islands, home to key Japanese bases and airfields. If captured, these islands would allow long-range B-29 bombers to strike the Japanese mainland. The Battle of Saipan was among the most pivotal battles in the Pacific. Over 70,000 U.S. troops stormed the beaches, facing intense resistance from 32,000 Japanese soldiers. The battle lasted nearly a month, with bitter hand-to-hand combat in the island's mountainous terrain. As American forces closed in, Japanese commanders ordered a mass suicide charge, the largest in the Pacific War. Over 4,000 Japanese troops rushed the U.S. lines in a final desperate attack. When the island was finally secured, over 29,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed, and thousands of civilians, including women and children, leapt from the cliffs rather than surrender. Following Saipan, U.S. forces moved on to Guam and Tinian, where they encountered similar fierce resistance. Tinian would soon become a launch site for American bombers, including the planes that would later drop atomic bombs on Japan. The loss of the Marianas shattered Japan's strategic position. Not only had the U.S. secured bases to bomb the Japanese mainland, but the defeat led to the downfall of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who resigned in disgrace. As U.S. forces invaded the Marianas, the Japanese Imperial Navy launched a desperate counterattack in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19th to 20th, 1944. This was Japan's final attempt to challenge American naval superiority, but it ended in disaster. Thanks to superior American aircraft, radar technology, and trained pilots, the U.S. decimated the Japanese fleet. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, leading to the battle's nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were also sunk, eliminating Japan's ability to wage large-scale naval battles. With Japan's air power shattered and the Marianas in American hands, the road to the Philippines and Japan was now open. The Pacific War had reached its final, most intense phase. By October 1944, the U.S. was ready to take back the Philippines, fulfilling General Douglas MacArthur's famous promise, "I shall return." The first step was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 23rd to 26th, 1944, the largest naval engagement in history, involving nearly 300 ships and over 200,000 sailors. The Japanese Imperial Navy, recognizing that a loss here would mean the end of its power in the Pacific, launched a desperate counterattack with its remaining battleships and aircraft carriers. The U.S. Navy, superior in numbers, firepower, and air support, crushed the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The battle effectively destroyed Japan's naval power, leaving the nation defenseless against future American invasions. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan introduced a terrifying new tactic, the kamikaze suicide pilots. These pilots flew explosive-laden aircraft directly into American ships, hoping to inflict devastating damage. The first successful attack hit USS St. Lo, an escort carrier, sinking it instantly. Over the following months, thousands of kamikaze pilots carried out similar missions, sinking or damaging dozens of U.S. warships. Though effective in causing fear and destruction, kamikaze missions were ultimately a desperate and unsustainable strategy. After Leyte Gulf, the U.S. launched its full-scale invasion of the Philippines, beginning with the Battle of Leyte, October-December 1944. American forces faced 120,000 Japanese defenders who resisted with fanatical determination. By December, the Japanese had suffered over 80,000 casualties, but fighting continued across the Philippines into mid-1945. The Battle of Manila, February-March 1945, was especially brutal. U.S. forces, determined to liberate the Philippine capital, faced stiff resistance in street-to-street combat. Japanese troops, under orders to fight to the death, slaughtered over 100,000 Filipino civilians, making it one of the worst massacres of the war. Despite the devastation, the battle ended with MacArthur's triumphant return to Manila. The Philippines were finally back in American hands, but the war was far from over. As American forces moved closer to Japan, they faced some of the most intense resistance of the war. The Battle of Iwo Jima, February 19th to March 26, 1945, would become one of the costliest battles in U.S. Marine Corps history. Iwo Jima was a small volcanic island, just 1,200 kilometers, 750 miles from Tokyo. Capturing it would provide the U.S. with a crucial airbase for bombing raids on Japan. But the Japanese, led by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had fortified the island for nearly a year. The island was riddled with underground tunnels, caves, and bunkers, allowing the 21,000 Japanese defenders to launch devastating ambushes. Kuribayashi forbade suicidal banzai charges, instead ordering his men to fight to the death from their fortifications. On February 19, 1945, over 70,000 U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima, expecting to face Japanese gunfire immediately. But the defenders remained silent, allowing thousands of Americans to land before opening fire all at once. The beach turned into a death trap. Mortars, machine guns, and artillery rained down on the Marines, causing horrific casualties. By nightfall, 2,400 Americans were dead or wounded. On February 23rd, after 4 days of brutal fighting, U.S. forces captured Mount Suribachi, the highest point on the island. To mark the victory, 6 Marines raised the American flag, a moment captured in one of the most famous photographs in history. However, the battle was far from over. For another month, the Marines fought yard by yard, clearing tunnels and bunkers. The Japanese refused to surrender, launching desperate nighttime raids and hidden ambushes. By March 26th, Iwo Jima was finally declared secure, but at a devastating cost. 6,800 U.S. Marines killed, over 20,000 wounded. Nearly all 21,000 Japanese defenders killed, with only 216 taken prisoner. Iwo Jima had been taken, but at a terrible price. The battle proved how fanatically Japan would defend its homeland, foreshadowing an even bloodier struggle ahead: Okinawa. By April 1945, the United States was preparing for the final stage of the war, the invasion of Japan's home islands. But before launching this assault, U.S. forces had to capture Okinawa, an island just 550 kilometers, 340 miles from Japan. What followed was the Battle of Okinawa, April 1st to June 22nd, 1945, the largest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Okinawa was the largest island in the Ryukyu chain and a crucial stepping stone for the U.S. military. If captured, it would serve as a staging ground for the planned invasion of Japan, a major air base for bombing raids on mainland Japan, a naval port for the U.S. fleet. The Japanese knew how vital Okinawa was and prepared for a fight to the death. Unlike previous battles where Japan defended the beaches, General Mitsuru Ushijima adopted a new strategy. He positioned 100,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan conscripts deep inside fortified bunkers, caves, and tunnels in the island's mountains. This allowed the defenders to bleed the U.S. forces dry while minimizing their own early losses. On April 1st, 1945, 183,000 U.S. troops landed on Okinawa. To their surprise, they met little resistance. Unlike Iwo Jima, where the Japanese fought immediately, Okinawa's beaches were nearly empty. For a week, U.S. forces advanced with minimal casualties. But it was a trap. As soon as they reached the rugged interior, Japanese troops sprang into action, unleashing artillery barrages, machine gun fire, and mortar strikes from hidden tunnels. Okinawa also saw the largest kamikaze attacks of the war. The Japanese launched over 1,500 suicide planes, targeting the U.S. fleet surrounding the island. These waves of human bombs inflicted massive damage. 34 U.S. ships sunk, including aircraft carriers and destroyers. 368 ships damaged. Over 4,900 American sailors killed. Despite their bravery, the kamikaze pilots could not change the outcome. The U.S. Navy absorbed the losses and continued the fight. The battle soon turned into a nightmare. Torrential rain turned the island into a sea of mud, slowing U.S. advances. The Japanese fought to the last man, launching counterattacks, ambushes, and banzai charges in the dead of night. By June 22, 1945, Okinawa was finally secured, but at a terrible cost. Over 12,500 Americans killed, with more than 49,000 wounded. 110,000 Japanese soldiers killed, with only 7,400 captured. Up to 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed either by Japanese suicide orders or caught in the crossfire. Okinawa had shown just how brutal the invasion of Japan's mainland would be. If this small island cost so many lives, how much blood would be spilled taking Tokyo? The U.S. military began to rethink its strategy. While battles raged on Okinawa, the U.S. Army Air Force began an unprecedented bombing campaign against Japan's cities. At first, the U.S. targeted Japanese factories and military bases with high-altitude precision bombing, but this strategy was ineffective. Japan's industry was scattered, and cloud cover often disrupted bombing runs. Then General Curtis LeMay adopted a new approach, firebombing Japan's densely populated cities. Japanese cities were mostly built with wood and paper, making them highly flammable. The Americans switched to using napalm-filled incendiary bombs, which could ignite entire city blocks in minutes. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, 334 B-29 bombers dropped 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The results were apocalyptic. 16 square miles of the city destroyed. Over 100,000 civilians burned alive. More than 1 million left homeless. It was the deadliest bombing raid in history, even worse than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. After Tokyo, the U.S. targeted other major Japanese cities. Over the next few months, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe were devastated. Kyoto, the ancient capital, was spared. Over 66 cities were bombed, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. The scale of destruction was unimaginable. By the summer of 1945, much of Japan's infrastructure had been reduced to ashes. And yet, the Japanese government refused to surrender. By July 1945, the U.S. faced a difficult decision. Option 1. Invade Japan, estimated 1 million U.S. casualties. Japan's entire population expected to resist, including women and children. Would prolong the war for another year or more. Option 2. Use the atomic bomb. A new terrifying weapon had just been tested successfully in New Mexico. It could force Japan's surrender without an invasion. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the U.S. issued a final warning. Surrender now or face total destruction. Japan ignored the ultimatum. This left only one option. By July 1945, Japan was on its last legs. Its navy was shattered, its air force nearly destroyed, and its cities burned to the ground. Yet the Japanese government refused to surrender. For the Allies, the next step was Operation Downfall, a full-scale invasion of Japan, set to begin in November 1945. But U.S. military planners estimated over 1 million American casualties, up to 5 million Japanese soldiers and civilians killed, a prolonged war into 1946 or beyond. As a result, President Harry S. Truman faced an agonizing choice: invade Japan and risk massive bloodshed, or use a newly developed weapon to force a swift end to the war. On July 16, 1945, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in the New Mexico desert. The explosion lit up the sky and produced a mushroom cloud over 10 kilometers high. Scientists and military leaders now understood the true power of their creation. A single bomb could destroy an entire city. With Japan unwilling to surrender, Truman made his decision. The atomic bomb would be used. 4 Japanese cities were initially chosen as possible targets: Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kyoto, later spared for its cultural significance. Kokura, Hiroshima was chosen because it was a major military and industrial center, as well as an important transportation hub. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island, carrying a single bomb. Little Boy, a 4,400-kilogram uranium bomb. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was dropped from 31,000 feet. 43 seconds later, it exploded 600 meters above Hiroshima. The results were catastrophic. A fireball hotter than the sun erupted over the city. A shockwave flattened everything within a 2-kilometer radius. 100,000 people died instantly. Thousands more suffered from radiation sickness and severe burns. Entire families were vaporized. The streets melted. Buildings turned to dust. Survivors, known as hibakusha, wandered through the ruins, skin hanging from their bodies like rags. Yet, despite the horror, Japan still did not surrender. With no response from Japan, a second bomb was ordered to be dropped. At 11:02 a.m., a B-29 named Boxcar dropped Fat Man, a plutonium bomb, over Nagasaki. Although Nagasaki was not the original target, Kokura was, but cloud cover forced a switch, the bomb still caused immense destruction. 40,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more perished from radiation and burns. The explosion was even more powerful than Hiroshima's. The shock of 2 atomic bombs finally broke Japan's will to fight. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed Japan in a radio broadcast, an unprecedented act for a Japanese emperor. He announced Japan's unconditional surrender, saying, "We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable." For the first time, Japan's people heard their godlike emperor's voice. The war was over. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan's representatives signed the formal surrender documents. Among those present were General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers; Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, representing the U.S. Navy officials from Britain, China, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations. With a final stroke of the pen, World War II was officially over. The war that had started with the bombing of Pearl Harbor ended with the signing of Japan's surrender papers. After 6 years of global conflict, the world could finally breathe again. The war in the Pacific had come at an enormous cost. Over 3 million Japanese killed, soldiers and civilians. More than 100,000 American lives lost in the Pacific. Tens of millions displaced, wounded, or left homeless. The horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki left a permanent scar on human history, leading to decades of nuclear fear and Cold War tensions. Following the surrender, General MacArthur led the occupation of Japan. Under his leadership, Japan's military was dismantled. A new constitution was written, influenced by the U.S., making Japan a democracy. Emperor Hirohito was allowed to remain, but he renounced his divine status. This occupation transformed Japan into the peaceful, modern nation it is today. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed warfare forever. The world had entered the atomic age, and the Cold War between the U.S. and Soviet Union would soon begin. In 1945, world leaders established the United Nations, UN, to prevent another global war. The horrors of World War II had shown the necessity of international cooperation. In a remarkable transformation, Japan became one of America's closest allies, with a strong economy and a pacifist constitution that endures to this day. The Pacific War had begun with Japanese imperial expansion, but it ended in total defeat and devastation. The world had changed forever. The power of aircraft carriers, strategic bombing, and nuclear weapons had redrawn the map of warfare. But the greatest change was Japan itself. Once a fierce empire, it was now a nation rebuilt on peace and diplomacy. The Pacific War was over. The world moved forward, but the echoes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would never be forgotten. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to The Time Travelers. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new video about history's most defining moments. See you in the next journey through time.